Welcome to Pierce Cedar Creek Institute for Environmental Education. Thank you for joining us. This video is a recording of a recent Institute program on climate-resilient land management here at the Institute. We are excited to welcome Mary Parr and Ellen Holste as our guest speakers for this program. My name is Emma Aleknowitz. I am our Community Program Manager here at Pierce Cedar Creek, and this is our Conservation in a Changing World series. I did put it up there. Today our speakers are Ellen and Mary, which I'm very excited about because they both work here at the Institute as well. So Mary is our stewardship person and Ellen is our research and community engagement manager. Okay. All right, so I'm going to hand it off to Ellen to start our presentation.
So welcome everyone. As you heard, I have moved into a slightly different role, but as you can see, you still get to see me. So it's good. So today we're going to be talking about one of our projects here at the Institute, but really talking about climate change and what does that mean for what we're doing. So before we get into some of that, I want you to just think about how you experience nature. So it's a beautiful day out there today. So think about in this beautiful day, what would you do? What would be the first thing that you would want to do outside? What are the things that you gravitate towards? Maybe it's walking your dog if you have a dog. Maybe it's painting outdoors. Maybe it's doing photography outdoors. Maybe it's just sitting and writing or journaling. Maybe you enjoy planting or gardening. Maybe you enjoy just walking the trails or just the pure joy of it. I love this expression right here. We do a lot of different things out in nature. And as we're doing those things, you may have noticed some things. Are the winters the same? Are the summers the same as maybe when you were a kid? Can you think of any things that have maybe changed over time? Well, if you've been paying attention to the news at all the past year, in 2024, Thin Ice cancels an ice fishing festival due to thin ice conditions. Snowmobile festivals have been canceled just in January of this year due to unseasonably warm weather. And Michigan skiing and dog sledding jeopardized by mild winter. And again, they claim it's due to as climate factors bring a warmer winter. So what does that mean? Well, we've been recording our weather for many, many years. And since the 1970s, so these two graphs are from the 1970s to almost present day, 2020 or 2021, we've had about 18 days that have been more warm. And this is from the Grand Rapids area, about 10 degrees warmer. That's a lot. So we have less extreme cold days, which as we're experiencing the winter and we experience a cold day, you're like, really? But overall is what we're looking at. On the other end, summers. This was from last year, 2023, August of 2023. Oh man, will this heat wave ever break? And in 2024, July of 2024 was the hottest July on record, according to NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric, I forget the last administration. There we go. They said July of this year was the hottest one in record in their 175-year history. So we are getting warmer too. And that affects how we do things in our daily lives. For example, how we garden. This came out in December of this last year, and Michigan has actually warmed on average 5 to 10 degrees or 5 degrees over the past 10 years, which affects what plants we can plant in our gardens. So we've gone from a zone 5B, which means that plants can survive minus 15 to minus 10 degrees, to a zone 6A. So they like a little bit warmer weather. But you may be thinking, okay, what does that all mean in the whole scheme of things? Well, I love this quote from Mark Twain. climate is what we expect and weather is what we get. Okay. So if you think about climate and weather, a lot of times we interchange those two words, but weather is basically what we experience from day to day. Have you ever used the phrase, you wait 5 minutes in Michigan, the weather will change? So that is what we're talking about when we talk about weather. Weather is that rainstorm that we might get. Weather is that cloudiness, that sunniness that maybe we're seeing right now, but it can change on more minutes to hours. Climate, on the other hand, is more that long term what we're looking at. It's that average over years over time. So when you think about weather, think about that Michigan, it's going to change every 5 minutes. Climate is that overall trend we're looking at. So when we talk about climate change, it's that long-term shift in global and local weather. And usually they're caused by carbon emissions and the greenhouse effect, but we see them as that big rain event that's coming up, maybe that flooding that's coming up. So what's actually causing climate change? Well, we get our sun's energy, which we're getting today, and we love that sun. It gives us nice vitamin D, but we do lots of activities that put all sorts of gases into the environment, whether it's driving our car, whether products are being made in factories, heating our homes, cooling our homes, even our animals, our cows also produce lots of gases. And basically all those gases go into the atmosphere and produce or make almost like a blanket that traps that sun's energy a lot more than what it used to do. And why should we care? Well, climate affects how we live our lives. We may not be skiing as much in the future if we have a different climate. We may need more of that fan in the future with a changing climate. It also affects how we live in terms of some of these events. So we're getting some more extreme weather events. We get droughts. We get floods. It's not just that little bit of rain at a time. It's that big amount of rain at one time that's not spread out throughout the season. Anybody remember those wildfires from Canada and all the smoke that we've gotten down here? So not just forest fires in Michigan, which we did get last summer, but also that smoke can affect our health, can affect how we live and how much we can get outside. Even this year, this is just all those different climatic disasters that have happened just within this year. Climate change is affecting home insurance costs. So our home insurance costs are going up due to climate change. And some areas, such as California with some of those wildfires, areas are becoming uninsurable. They can't insure homes. But notice, here's Michigan. Here's a lot of those natural disasters that cost a lot of money just this year. You may have heard the term that Michigan is a climate haven. Has anyone heard that term before? Okay. So it came out last year. They talked a lot more about it as Michigan being a climate haven. Some places are better positioned to what's coming up. And so maybe you might get more people moving to Michigan because this is an area that will withstand all of that's going on in terms of climate change. But some of these climate haven cities might not be ready for some of this extreme weather. So these are some of the cities that they claim are climate havens: Minneapolis, Duluth, Madison, Ann Arbor, so in Michigan. And if you notice, the red basically means the temperature change is going to increase even more in those areas. Anyone been following Hurricane Helene recently? Hurricane Helene affected areas that they thought they would never affect, some of these more climate haven areas. So there may not be really climate haven areas. We're all experiencing what's going on. And by the end of this century, Michigan climate may feel a lot more like we live in the US, southern US. So this is the climate that we'd been experiencing. And all of these basically mean, depending upon what emissions, so what gases are being put into the atmosphere, we may eventually feel more like Oklahoma does right now, or we may feel more like Georgia. But the future climate in our area, how we live our lives now, will be very different for future generations. If you think back to how you experience nature, there may be no maple sugaring. We may not get low enough temperatures for that. Oh, this one's a sad one for some people I know. No ice fishing or cross-country skiing or even snowshoeing. No snowman building Remember all those times that you built a snowman and you went sledding with your friends or your siblings? This is one I don't like. Higher cooling bills. We might get more tick and mosquito diseases. Increase in venomous or invasive species. I know this is doom and gloom, but worse air quality, respiratory problems, increases in heat stroke, increased drought. There's a lot of things that we may experience. Enough with the doom and gloom, right? We're done. So if you've noticed some of these things and are maybe concerned, you're not alone. Nearly 3 in 4 people said that climate change is happening and hurting people in the US. So you're not alone in this. More than half of Michiganders are worried about what they call global warming, but basically climate change. And 7 in 10 Americans say they feel sad about what's happening. I feel sad about it. And about 70% of Americans think that they'll have to make changes, whether it's major or minor, to their everyday lives because of climate change. So again, you're not alone. So Mary's going to talk about what we are doing at the Institute, because if you've seen all that, you may feel like, oh, now I'm going to just leave here depressed. Hopefully you do not. Hopefully you leave here feeling like there's something being done. That is our goal today. But I did want to bring up what we see. So Mary's going to talk about the program that we've been doing here, but a quick mic change. Give us a second.
All right. Thank you, Ellen, for that background information about the importance of climate change. And she brought up a lot of very important points. And we have been considering this as the Institute. And so this is all kind of driving towards this program, Climate Resilient Land Management, and our efforts to integrate climate into our approach of how we're going to manage our own property. And so we're going to be where we have tested and monitored and documented a lot of items, which I'll go into. We're investigating some resilient practices and then also incorporating education into the community and other conservation partners. So first, when thinking about different programs related to climate change, carbon banking or carbon storage has been a popular way to offset some of our emissions. And so these programs generally focus on industrial emissions and incorporate ways to capture that carbon into forests or trees. And so those programs are kind of solely focused on capturing this carbon. But we know that when thinking about the resilience and health of our ecosystems, biodiversity is also very important. There's a ton of other things that go into making a healthy system. And so for our program, we're looking at doing both of those. We're thinking about carbon, but that's only one item among this list of other things that's important to include. And so what is climate resilience? Resilience is kind of the natural areas community approach of resisting some of those stressors like drought or flooding, and its capacity to survive and sustain itself after some of those big events. And so the best way I can describe resilience is often thinking about our own bodily health. When you think about we're going into, winter, there's a lot of illness kind of going around. What do you do with your body? It's good to eat healthy foods, to exercise, take care of your mental health. And when you don't do that, you can often put yourself as a more susceptible state to chronic illnesses, or infection or things like that. And so when we think of our natural areas, they also have health. And so poor health or poor resilience to these stressors often comes to areas that don't have a lot of biodiversity. So when you think of like these big lawns that are just supporting grass and not a lot of other insects or other animals, large agriculture kind of displaces a lot of those different animals. Often that leads to exposing these areas to more advanced erosion and other items. We also have a lot of invasive species that once an area is kind of damaged, they can infest and take over. And some of our natural areas, if we don't manage them, like forests, they can become overstocked and reduce in health. And so this is an image of the pine bark beetle infestation in some areas out west. But when we think of good resilience, that's often related to biodiversity. And so this is a picture of a very diverse prairie. And what goes into that health and resilience is incorporating those natural disturbances like fire or grazing, and then also the people that are, collecting seeds and incorporating new species into that area, managing invasive species. All of those things are really important to promoting the system health so that when stressors do come, the area is resilient and can respond when it's at peak health. So what does this mean for the Institute? We have 850 acres. Historically, when we first got the property, a lot of this was in agriculture. And so through the past 20 years, we've restored a lot of these grasslands. We've managed the property. We have over 800 species of plants. But now we're faced with this climate change issue. And so how do we continue to protect this property and all the biodiversity that we have? And so we spent a lot of time as a staff thinking about how do we put together a program that we can integrate some of these adaptive management techniques and then also test their effectiveness over the long term. And so our primary goals of this project are to maintain and enhance biodiversity, to promote species that are resilient to these climate stressors, and then also to encourage carbon storage in our property. And so we put together a pilot year that we were going to really concentrate our efforts and test a lot of these different items, learn about a lot of different practices that we can do. And so fortunately for us, we are a biological field station and we have a lot of connections to academics and different universities. And so one of our priorities for those universities is to help us track some of our rare and endangered species and look at how climate might be affecting our property. We also did a bunch of biodiversity monitoring. So this kind of helped us get a baseline of what do we have in terms of flora and fauna. And, we can remeasure 5 years from now and see, has this changed? Have our management efforts helped? And then we were able to put together some adaptive land management that we can do and take action on to promote those healthy species and look at climate adapt species that might be resilient. And so our biological field station, we had 2 projects in 2023 that were really helping us gather information. The first one was a carbon storage project. And so individuals from Calvin University, Dave Dornbos, they had actually come 10 years ago and did some carbon assessments on the property. And so we connected with them and they were able to come back and see 10 years later what the status is of the carbon on the property. And so they produced us a map of the soil carbon. So we were able to see all of our different soil types and how much carbon they had in them. And they looked at old forest, young forest, and prairie. And of those, they found that a lot of our old forest had a ton of carbon, but didn't have a lot of room to increase the carbon because they're so healthy. But they found that young forest and prairie had a ton of space to incorporate more carbon. And so that tells us that these are some opportunities to focus on gaining more carbon into the soil. They also did an assessment of 8 different plant species and looked at how productive they were. And it happened to be that we had a drought during the time that they were assessing them, which actually gave us some really interesting information. And so we were able to see the different species and how they responded to this drought. And the oak species had the best plant productivity. It did not waver at all. They were still just as productive, which is helpful in identifying what plants are going to do well in case of a drought stressor. The second project we had was focused on eastern box turtles. And so this has been a long-term project of increasing our box turtle population and learning more about them. Box turtles in general have a 1% or less survival rate. Most of this is due to raccoon predation once the eggs are laid. But this program takes those eggs out of the field, They take them to John Ball Zoo, they hatch, they feed them all winter long, and the result is, this is the size of a hatchling when it starts, and then within a winter, they're about the size of a 4 to 5 year old turtle. And so they found that 66% of these head starts survived 1 year. So 66% is way higher than 1% or less. They also tracked the turtles, the adults and the head starts, and they found that they're using a variety of different land cover types. So they're using forest and wetland and open areas. So this kind of helps inform us of what the turtles are using and what we need to do to protect those habitats. This project also had the drought during its experiment, and they found that the adult turtles were waiting a long time to lay their eggs. And so this also kind of tells us what individual species might be doing as a response to these changing temperatures. So that was an interesting component as well. This past summer, we also had a lot of different projects that were including climate in their program. And so they did more research on secretive marsh birds, eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes, western lesser siren, and also toxic algal blooms. So going forward, we're kind of accepting a lot of these projects that are incorporating climate. And so getting to the work that we did last year, so we were interested in measuring the biodiversity and performing some land management. As you can imagine, we have, 850 acres. That's a pretty large chunk of property. And so we decided to focus on a smaller area that we could test a lot of these things and measure more effectively. So we found that the area down by the sand prairie was a really good spot to focus on. It's about 65 acres, and it has a variety of different natural community types that are represented across our larger property. And so we decided to focus in on this area. And so the first thing we did is we did a botanical survey within that 65 acres. We found that there were about 120 different species that we identified. Across the distribution of that area, about 57% of the plants there were native. We did find one new rare species population, which was really exciting. And then we also found a new invasive species, glossy buckthorn. And so because we found it early, we were able to treat it and remove it and avoid having a big infestation. And then we did a forestry survey. So we were interested in looking at the forestry health and gathering more information. We found that the area was very oak and sugar maple dominated, but it was very overgrown and very overstocked in some areas. So for this forest, it meant that the canopy was so dense that there wasn't a lot of light coming down to the understory. There's a lot of bare spots where there weren't any herbaceous plants covering the soil. And so that was helpful for us to know in developing our goals. We also did an assessment on different animals. And so we did a lot of literature review to see, what are the important groups to study as we're monitoring biodiversity. And so we focused on birds. So we found 26 different bird species that were using that area. We also found through literature that woodpeckers and woodcock are good indicators of health in those oak hickory forests. So we'll be kind of looking for their presence going forward. We also had a small mammal camera trapping. So this is kind of a barrier that small mammals will walk into, different reptiles will walk into. They'll pass through a bucket that has a camera. And so this is one of the images we captured. And so we're able to look through those images and get an idea of, what different species were using that area. And then we also studied moths and butterflies. And so this one was kind of a challenge because we were running out there with butterfly nets, trying to capture these individuals with some success. When we found them, some of them were easy to identify, but then other ones were really challenging. And you kind of need a specialist present to be able to identify some of those. But we did find a lot of this moth. We're like, what is this moth? And it turns out it was the spongy moth. So that was helpful to know that, oh, this part of the property has a really big population of spongy moth. And so after doing all of this baseline data collection, we were able to develop a few goals for this area. So we decided to focus on managing the invasive species that are in that area. The forest that is very overstocked, we would like to thin out a little bit to allow more oaks to regenerate and to allow more native plants to establish. And then ultimately, we want to promote more plant diversity that's growing in that area. And so we started doing this in 2023. We started our invasive species control. We managed a lot of woody invasives like autumn olive and honeysuckle and multiflora rose, also garlic mustard. We had a lot of work days that people came out and helped us with these efforts. We did a lot of seed collection, and so we were collecting a lot of species for this site that were like super pollinator plants. They have long bloom periods. They're used by a lot of different insects, very drought tolerant. And so we collected a lot of those. And then we also did a prescribed burn. So this is kind of the sand prairie opening. You can see a few staff members there. And so this is the area about 3 months later. So we had a great burn. It was very effective at suppressing a lot of the invasive species in the area. It helped remove a lot of the plant buildup so then seeds could get to the soil and germinate. And it also kind of helped promote that box turtle habitat. Another thing we did is we installed 1,000 native plants in the area. So some of the forested sites had very limited plant cover. And so with our plants that we grew at the Institute, we were able to plant these in those areas. And this site was a shady spot, so we found a lot of different diverse shade-tolerant plants that we could incorporate. And the last thing that we're focusing on is a forestry management plan. And so the Institute has a forestry management section in our land management plan, but it's limited to old growth and young growth. And on the property, we have 475 acres. They're all different community types and different stages that have different needs. And so we decided to pursue this forestry management plan with Davy Resources. And so they're going to go out and identify and map all the different forestry areas. They're going to help us construct a plan that incorporates a lot of these adaptive management techniques. And so going forward, we'll have a really clear direction and what sites to prioritize. And so what's next? Well, we have expanded the CRLM program to the entire property. So now that we've kind of finished our micro study, we're ready to expand to a bigger area. We're working on the forestry management plan, which will be done in December. And then we're also going to expand our land management plan to include a lot of these climate adapted approaches so that within the next 10 years, we'll have a clear idea of what we need to do to preserve our biodiversity.
So you've heard about a lot of what we're doing. So what does that mean? For us, a major part of what we're calling CRLM, so Climate Resilient Land Management, it's a long acronym, but basically a major part of this is education. We're learning as we're doing some of these practices, we're learning, but we also want to educate our local community so you can do the same stuff on your property. You can learn from what we're doing. We're testing, we're documenting, we're evaluating at the same time. But there are some things you could do now. Again, I like Mark Twain quotes. I don't know why, but everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Let's do something about it. So this article came out just recently, August 28th of this year. Americans love nature, but don't feel empowered to protect. New research shows. Hopefully you do feel empowered, but just in case you don't, in this study, they did have one survey question that I thought was really interesting. What is the role of humans in nature? And some of the responses that they got was, well, we should care for and preserve the earth. Okay, yeah. Humans depend on earth and its resources. Okay, yeah. Humans take too much from nature. That's a value judgment. Nature benefits for human health and well-being, not a complete sentence, but we benefit from the health and well-being. And humans can choose to be a positive or negative force in nature. And we've all heard about those big and little things we can do, right? There's so many big and little things. Make your money count, plant native species, consider your travel options. But now's the time to actually do them. So I'm going to go through just a few things. There is a handout at the back, and Emma will also send it out for those on Zoom. But just some things that you can do in a few seconds, in a few minutes, a few hours. Things that we can do now to start that process while we're still learning with CRLM. So I'm just going to highlight a few of them. But one, adopt climate-friendly takeout practices. We've all been to a restaurant and they give you that big meal that's really, really good, but it doesn't all fit in your belly. So we want to take it home. Well, a lot of times when we go to these restaurants, there's plastic take-home or there's styrofoam take-home. You can actually bring your own take-home container, or you can choose to use what restaurant you go to by what is their takeout practices? Do they give you plastic? Do they give you compostable materials? You can choose what you want to do on that. What about in a few minutes? Well, the one I want to emphasize is pay your bills online or via mobile. The cost of paper just to even produce paper, and then that cost to then ship that bill through the mail, those all have carbon costs. So think about paying your bills online. What about in a few hours? There's lots of things we can do in a few hours. But think about how you shop. You can shop here at the gift shop. That would be local. You can shop in town. That would be local. If you shop on Amazon, think about maybe a slower shipping or grouping your orders together. All of those things can help. What about each day of the week? I like talking about taking personal care. So a few years ago, one of our artists came out and she was talking about taking personal care and how that can help the environment. I was like, what does that actually mean? And so the idea of some of us may use body wash in our showers. That comes in a plastic container. If you use a poof to wash yourself down, think about taking that bar of soap, putting your poof on it, and not thinking about that plastic container. So there's things that we can do in our personal hygiene. Instead of using a cotton ball, use a reusable rag. There are other ways that we can make those little changes. What about in a few months? In this list, I like to emphasize planting something because we're here at the Institute. Plant something that can help take up that carbon, that extra emissions that are going into the atmosphere. And if you're going to plant something native. Native plants will withstand a lot of these more climatic changes than a lot of those non-natives that may be pretty. I get it, they're pretty, but there's a lot of pretty native plants as well. And right now, while you're doing one of these things right now, educate yourself. As I mentioned, a big part of the CRLM project that we have here is to educate you. So continue to learn. There's lots of different ways to do that. Speak up. Having those conversations with your partner, your neighbor, your friends, even a stranger, having those conversations makes this normalized. It becomes part of that greater conversation, and that's how things change. Get involved. There's lots of ways of getting involved. I'll talk about one in just a second, but also talking with your wallet. How you spend your money shows what you value. So getting involved, well, stay informed. Tell your friends. We did talk about that. Check out the Institute's Facebook and YouTube pages. We keep posting some stuff about what we're doing here. And the Stewardship Department has done a great job of offering stewardship experiences to kind of get involved in the process of what we're doing with CRLM. But part of my new role, so Emma kind of tripped over my title. It's a long title, I get it. But Research and Community Engagement Manager, basically I wanted to show that we're really trying to do a good way of saying it, community-driven stewardship. So if you ever heard of the term community science, citizen science, these are things that we want to expand our offerings to you so you can get involved in documenting what we're doing, get involved in some of this research as well. One such example I do have on the table is our photo point monitoring project. So for those photographers out there, it's as simple as taking a picture at a couple of our restoration sites, and we're going to make a time lapse of how that restoration is progressing so you can actually see that. One is over in that parcel that Mary was talking about, where we had the burn, and then she showed a beautiful site, picture of the site all green. Well, we want to see how that site changes. So at the very bottom of our property on our white trail is one. The other one's just behind our visitor center here. So whenever you're out here, maybe on the trails, just take a picture, send it to us, and then we can see how that is changing. So it can be as simple as that. We'll have other projects coming up. So pay attention. You'll see some cool things hopefully coming up. And of course, there's always, you could financially support the project. As I said, talk with your wallet. These are our current sponsors. We're always open to new sponsors, but this is the boots on the ground in your own backyard idea. So what will you do? So at this point, we welcome any questions, but I do want to point out this quote by Tom Brokaw. You will not solve global climate change by hitting the delete button, unfortunately. So I see Emma might have some questions here.
Okay, so the question is, what was the rare new plant species? I'm debating if I want to tell you guys. So we found a rare orchid that we have on the property, but we found a new couple individuals. So that was really exciting. And I won't tell you where, unfortunately, because yeah, we want to make sure it's protected.
So somebody says, I think there used to be a sensitive feature on Amazon to request no plastic packaging. I'm not sure how well it works. There are ways when you order things online that you can click on, I want things in one shipment. I want things without that plastic packaging. So there are ways. Sometimes, unfortunately, you do have to dig. But it might be fun. I see our marketing person here. It might be fun to compile a list of some of those if you're interested.
So this next question, I'm going to do my best to phrase it. Young forest and prairie, what's most likely to increase carbon? Any data and relative rates of carbon storage? So let's see. I gotta think about this for a second. So there's a lot of different ways to increase carbon storage. Some of them are like doing prescribed burns. So breaking down that carbon, some of the carbon is released. And then when the plants undergo a disturbance like fire, it kind of invigorates them. And so they like put a ton of resources into their roots. They're expanding their root systems. And so that's like putting in more carbon than was released. So incorporating a lot of those natural disturbances is important to kind of make these robust plants that are storing carbon. Once those roots start to die and decay, a lot of the organisms eat them up, and then they live in the soil and die in the soil, and then it increases over time. Soil carbon can get a little complex. So if you want to talk more about it later, I'd be happy to in more detail.
All right, I'm going to give you this one, but I'll address the next one. The next one is for climate havens. Why large cities with lots of cement? So climate havens usually, that one graph I showed or that one image I showed the cities. And yes, there's a lot of cement in the cities, but usually it's more states or areas that are listed as climate havens. So like the state of Michigan has been listed as a climate haven because we have all that nice fresh water around us. We have quite a few forests here in Michigan for taking up that carbon. But for some reason, I don't know why that particular one highlighted the cities. So it's usually more areas than cities in
particular. This next question is, what is a drift fence? So that was one of the monitoring devices, I guess you could say. And so that's the one where the small mammals, let me start over. We install a board about 9 inches tall, and then on each end of the board is a bucket with a camera pointed down. And so when the organisms are moving from the wetland to the upland, they walk into this board and they naturally want to go around the barrier. And so they go around the board through a bucket with the camera, takes a picture of them, and they carry on their way. So that's what a drift fence is, and it's becoming a very popular sampling technique.
Can I tell the potential?
Yes.
So we are going to have a potential, I had to ask, a potential community science project around that. So if you're interested in looking at what animals on pictures that we're getting from that fence, that is a potential project that we are looking for volunteers. In the future, we're still figuring out right now how that all will work, but that's another project that you could get involved with. This one I feel like Emma needs to answer, but in 2010, a park ranger at Pictured Rocks National Park, maybe that was Emma. No, that wasn't Emma. Okay. Stated the climate. So if you didn't know, she used to work for Pictured Rocks. Stated the climate in Pictured Rocks area would in 2030 be that in 2010 St. Louis, Missouri. Would that still be an accurate statement? So yeah, it is accurate in the sense of our climate is warming. And the farther south you go in the United States, usually the warmer you get. And St. Louis, Missouri is warmer than where we are in Michigan. I would say that's probably still a fairly accurate statement. Eventually, if we still go in the direction we're going, we might get more like Arkansas, so either farther south than Missouri and more like Oklahoma. It really depends on what we're doing. And by that, I mean, our climate would be similar to what the current conditions are in Oklahoma and current conditions are in Arkansas. And I don't want to live in Arkansas. My sister lives there. It's not because of my sister. It's more that I see all the humidity from there. Oh, here's one for you. Last one.
Okay. Can we expect more deer EHD in years to come? So this question is kind of asking about animal diseases. And so in general, a lot of the plant and animal diseases that are further south, as our climate changes and it becomes warmer here, it'll be more available for them to spread into our area. So we've seen that with tick populations that have been increasing in the last few years. And so with EHD especially, that disease is related to a midge that is like an insect that bites the deer and then gives them this disease. And so the midge dies after the first frost. And so if we're having later frosts into the fall, it could leave more time for this infection to occur. It gets very in the weeds of the different life cycles of different diseases and pests. So in this case, it could increase the infection rate, but it also has bloom periods and periods that it doesn't happen for a while. So EHD in general is like on a 5-year rotation. It occurs.
And there's a lot of diseases that as things get warmer, we may see more. It's just things can thrive when it gets a little warmer. So, all right. So I did have a reluctance for an electric car because I know that some people are reluctant for electric cars. We did put that up there as a thing that you could do. And I know there are pros and cons to any vehicle that you get in terms of an electric car. There's a lot of new things coming up. There's a lot of things in terms of you do have to wait for it to charge. Technology is getting better. I know in our family, we decided to make that a priority, but maybe there's something else you prioritize now. I'm not saying you have to go out and do these things. I'm just giving you options of try one thing. It's overwhelming to try too many things. Try one thing. Start with that. Okay, that worked okay. Try that next thing. It's just getting you to start the process. I feel like that's the hardest part. Is starting it. So I'm not saying you have to do all these things. These are options of things to do. But again, start small and you can maybe work your way up to something bigger. So, yes, I love online questions.
Yeah, the question was if the Institute has considered doing rotational grazing as a part of prairie management. I love grazing. I love rotational grazing. The Institute has thought about it, but we are limited in some ways by organizing that as far as fencing infrastructure, also having animals, who's going to take care of them. And so I would love to see that happen in the next decade. I think it's a great management tool, but it's going to take a little bit of time and planning and fundraising to work out the kinks of that.
Yeah, didn't we look at some animals at one point?
We did look at goat or sheep grazing, but it was very expensive. So
the question was?
The question was if we would consider leasing out the property to a local landowner or animal owner to do some grazing. So that is a common practice in the plains, is to lease your property for grazers. Typically, those contracts, the landowner maintains all the fencing structure, and then the animal person brings in their cattle. Bison especially need robust fencing. Sometimes they need to have 12-foot tall fencing. And so it's a logistical challenge, but it could be a pathway to get grazers if we were to install fencing and then lease the property out. But
Do we have enough prairie for bison?
Bison in general need a very large swath of area because they are landscape level grazers. And so usually you want to have a few hundred acres of continuous prairie in order to kind of satisfy their needs as a herd. Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics that goes into stocking rates and property size and forage cover, and yeah.
It's something that we're looking into, but everything has a priority and not everything can be priority one, right? And so this is just where we're focusing now and going from there. Well, if nobody else has any more questions, it's almost lunchtime. If you have questions in the future about this project or want to get involved in whatever way, reach out to us. We're always happy to answer questions. And feel free to take any materials in the back. Oh, we got one more. Yes. The comment was another thing you can do is buy bulk. And so you cut down on packaging. To be honest, cut down on trips for me. So, all right. Well, thank you all and enjoy the weather out there.